Modern sourdough is treated like a fragile ritual. Every step is measured, every hour watched, every change feared. Miss a feeding, the starter dies. Miss a window, the dough is ruined. But bread did not survive centuries by being delicate. It survived because it could tolerate neglect, mistakes, cold nights, bad grain, and long waits. Medieval bakers did not have the luxury of precision. They had responsibility. If their bread failed, there was no backup. What we call progress in baking quietly removed resilience. Thermometers replaced judgment. Schedules replaced instinct. Freshness replaced usefulness. Medieval sourdough was never designed to look impressive on the day it was baked. It was designed to last, to be reused, to be trusted when conditions were poor and time was uncertain. Their methods were shaped by hunger, not preference. This script is not about romantic old-world baking or copying the past for nostalgia. It is about recovering practical intelligence that was lost when baking became comfortable. Every method you are about to hear exists because it solved a real problem: how to keep bread alive when life was unstable. Once you understand how medieval bakers built strength into their sourdough, modern baking starts to look less advanced and more dependent. Starters were intentionally stressed to remove weak yeast. Medieval bakers did not treat their starter like something fragile that could break at any moment. They did not rush to save it the second it slowed down or smelled sharp. If the starter became very sour, watery, or looked tired, they did not panic. They let it reach that state on purpose. Sometimes it sat for days without food. Sometimes it thinned and fell flat. Sometimes it looked close to dead. This was not carelessness. It was a quiet way of testing strength. When a starter is always fed on time and kept warm and comfortable, weak yeast survives just as easily as strong yeast. Everything lives, even what should not. Over time, this creates a starter that only works under perfect conditions. The moment the room gets cold, the flour changes, or feeding is delayed, the starter struggles. Medieval bakers did not want a starter like that. They wanted one that could survive hunger, cold nights, poor grain, and long breaks between baking. By allowing the starter to suffer a little, the weak microbes died off naturally. They could not handle the acidity, the lack of food, or the changing conditions. The strong microbes adapted. They learned how to wake up fast, how to ferment hard when food returned, and how to survive when nothing was ideal. Each time the starter was revived after being ignored, it came back tougher than before. This is why medieval starters could be carried across villages, stored through winter, or left untouched between baking days without collapsing. The starter was not kept alive by constant care. It was shaped by pressure. Every period of hunger made it more reliable. Every revival made it faster and stronger. Instead of protecting the starter from stress, medieval bakers used stress as a tool to build something that would not fail when life became difficult. Fermented dough was stored dry, not maintained wet. Medieval bakers did not depend on a constantly wet, bubbling starter that needed daily attention. In many places, that would have been impossible. Winters were long. Baking was not done every day. Travel, shortages, and sudden changes were normal. So instead of keeping all their fermentation alive and active, they learned how to pause it safely. One of the most reliable ways they did this was by drying pieces of already fermented dough. After a batch of dough had fermented well, a small portion was pulled away before baking. It was flattened, torn into small bits, and left to dry in the air until it became hard. Once dry, it could be stored for weeks or even months without spoiling. In this dry state, the yeast and bacteria did not die. They went to sleep. Everything slowed down, but the living culture remained inside. When baking was needed again, those dry pieces were soaked in water and mixed with fresh flour. Slowly, the culture woke back up. Because it had survived complete dryness, only the strongest microbes remained. They came back active and focused, not weak or confused. This made fermentation start with surprising strength, even after long storage. Modern bakers often fear letting a starter dry out because they assume dryness kills it. Medieval bakers knew the opposite. Constant moisture invites decay, mold, and dependency. Dryness protects, preserves, and simplifies. There was no need for daily feeding, no worry about missing a schedule, and no fear of total loss if baking stopped for a long time. This method also allowed bakers to travel, share culture between households, and survive seasons when flour or fuel was scarce. The fermentation was not chained to the kitchen. It could be carried, stored, and revived when conditions allowed. Instead of constantly maintaining life, medieval bakers learned how to pause it safely and restart it when needed. Fermentation was controlled by location, not water temperature. Medieval bakers did not heat or cool their water to control how fast dough fermented. They had no thermometers and no reason to shock the dough with sudden temperature changes. Instead, they controlled fermentation by choosing where the dough rested. The place mattered more than the liquid. Stone buildings, earth floors, cellars, barns, shaded corners, and oven rooms all created different speeds of fermentation without touching the water at all. When bakers wanted the dough to slow down, they moved it into a cool cellar or a thick stone room where the air stayed calm and cold. The dough rested there quietly, fermenting slowly and evenly. When they needed more activity, the dough was placed closer to warmth, sometimes near the oven after it had been fired, or in a sun-warmed corner of the building. The temperature changed gently through the air, not suddenly through water, so the yeast adapted smoothly instead of being stressed. Modern bakers often try to control fermentation by adjusting water temperature aggressively. Hot water forces fast activity. Cold water slows things down sharply. This creates sudden swings that confuse the yeast and bacteria, leading to unpredictable results. Medieval bakers avoided this problem entirely. They let the dough live in a stable environment where changes happened slowly and naturally. Because the dough stayed in one place for hours or overnight, the microbes learned the rhythm of that space. They did not rush and then crash. They moved steadily. Fermentation became calmer, deeper, and more reliable. If the weather changed, the baker changed the location, not the recipe. The dough followed the season instead of fighting it. This approach also meant the baker did not need precision tools or exact numbers. The building itself became the control system. Walls, earth, and air did the regulating. By trusting location instead of temperature tricks, medieval bakers created fermentation that was stable, forgiving, and far less fragile than most modern methods. Fermentation was often paused and resumed. Medieval bakers did not believe fermentation had to move in one straight line from start to finish. Life was unpredictable, and baking had to bend around it. Work, weather, lack of fuel, or sudden travel could interrupt the process at any time. Instead of forcing fermentation to continue no matter what, bakers learned how to slow it down, pause it, and restart it without ruining the dough. Sometimes dough was mixed and allowed to ferment partway, then left to rest in a cool place where activity slowed almost to a stop. Other times, dough was shaped and held for many hours before baking. In some cases, loaves were lightly baked first and fully baked later when the oven was ready again. These pauses were not mistakes. They were planned adjustments that gave the baker control without clocks or machines. Pausing fermentation allowed excess sharpness to settle and gave the dough time to strengthen on its own. When fermentation resumed, the yeast did not panic or overreact. It simply continued its work. Because the pause happened gradually through cooler air or reduced access to warmth, the microbes stayed alive and stable. Nothing was shocked or forced. Modern sourdough often treats fermentation as fragile, something that must be watched constantly or it will fail. Medieval bakers trusted that good dough could wait. They knew fermentation was resilient if it had been built correctly from the beginning. This made baking less stressful and far more forgiving. By learning how to stop and restart fermentation, bakers gained freedom. They were not chained to perfect timing. The dough adapted to the baker's life instead of the baker serving the dough. This flexibility is one of the quiet strengths of medieval sourdough that modern baking has almost completely forgotten. Salt was adjusted for storage, not recipe consistency. Medieval bakers did not treat salt as a fixed number that never changed. There was no idea of a correct percentage that had to be followed every time. Salt was adjusted based on purpose, season, and how long the bread needed to last. Bread was not always meant to be eaten the same day. Some loaves were baked for travel, some for winter storage, some for daily meals, and each of these needed different protection. When bread had to last longer, more salt was used. Salt slowed fermentation, reduced spoilage, and made mold grow more slowly. This allowed bread to survive days or even weeks without turning bad. When bread was meant for immediate use, less salt was added so fermentation could move more freely and the loaf would stay softer. The baker decided the salt, not the recipe. Modern baking often locks salt into a strict formula, treating it as nothing more than a flavor enhancer. Medieval bakers understood salt as a controlling force. It affected how fast the dough fermented, how strong the structure became, and how long the bread stayed usable. Salt helped manage time when refrigeration did not exist. Salt also allowed bakers to work with weaker flour or warmer weather. If conditions would cause dough to spoil too fast, salt was increased slightly to slow everything down. If conditions were cool and calm, less salt was needed. This made baking adaptable instead of rigid. By adjusting salt with intention, medieval bakers could shape the life of the bread beyond the oven. The loaf was designed for its future, not just its taste. Modern recipes chase consistency from loaf to loaf. Medieval baking chased reliability across changing conditions. Loaves were shaped for durability, not open crumb. Medieval bakers did not shape bread to look impressive when sliced open. They shaped bread to survive use, storage, and time. Open crumb was not a goal because large air pockets caused bread to dry out faster, grow mold unevenly, and fall apart when soaked or cut. Dough was shaped firmly and with intention. Air was not chased or exaggerated. The baker pressed and folded the dough so it became compact and stable, not loose and fragile. This created a tight interior that slowed moisture loss and made the bread resistant to cracking and crumbling. The loaf aged more evenly because the structure supported itself. Durable shaping also made bread practical. It could be sliced thin without tearing. It could be dipped into soup or water without collapsing. It could be carried, stacked, and stored without losing its form. Modern bread often looks beautiful when fresh, but becomes useless once it dries. Medieval bread remained useful long after it cooled. A tighter crumb also protected the bread from spoilage. Air pockets invite moisture imbalance and mold. Dense structure kept conditions inside the loaf more stable. This was especially important when bread had to last through warm days or damp environments. Medieval bakers understood that shaping was not about display. It was about purpose. The loaf was built like a tool, not a decoration. Strength came before softness, and reliability mattered more than appearance. Oven heat decline was used deliberately. Medieval bakers did not bake with steady, unchanging heat. Their ovens were fired once with wood, then the fire was removed, and baking happened as the heat slowly fell. Instead of seeing this decline as a problem, they used it on purpose. The changing temperature of the oven was part of the method, not a flaw that needed correction. When the oven was at its hottest, loaves that needed thick, protective crusts were baked first. The strong heat sealed the outside quickly, locking in moisture and creating a hard shell that protected the bread from drying out or spoiling. As the oven cooled, other loaves were baked at lower heat. These developed softer crusts and were meant to be eaten sooner. One firing produced different kinds of bread simply by timing. Modern ovens try to hold the same temperature from start to finish, using constant power to force consistency. Medieval ovens worked with natural heat loss. This created more balanced loaves because the intense heat at the beginning set structure, while the gentler heat later finished the bake without burning the outside or leaving the inside raw. The slow decline in heat also allowed moisture to escape gradually instead of violently. This reduced cracking, improved crumb stability, and helped the bread stay usable longer. Bakers learned the personality of their ovens and timed each batch by feel, sound, and color rather than numbers. By embracing falling heat instead of fighting it, medieval bakers turned limitation into control. The oven itself became a living tool that changed throughout the day, and skilled bakers used that change to shape the final bread with precision that did not depend on modern machines. Bread was designed for a second life. Medieval bakers did not bake bread with the idea that it would be finished once it cooled. From the very beginning, the bread was planned to live more than one life. Fresh bread was only the first stage. What mattered more was what the bread would become after a day, after several days, and even after it hardened. This completely changed how dough was mixed, fermented, shaped, and baked. Bread was expected to dry out. That was not a flaw, it was part of the design. Thick crusts were encouraged because they protected the inside, while allowing the loaf to slowly lose moisture instead of spoiling quickly. Hydration was chosen so the crumb would firm up without collapsing. Fermentation was deep, so flavor would grow stronger with time instead of fading. Everything was built around the idea that bread would age, not disappear. Stale bread was not thrown away. It was soaked in water, broth, or milk and eaten as porridge or stew. It was sliced thin and toasted until hard, then stored again for travel. It was ground and reused. It was softened and eaten when fresh bread was unavailable. In some cases, it was even used as a base for further fermentation. Bread was food security, not a momentary pleasure. Because bread was meant to be reused, it had to hold its shape when wet. Soft, airy bread would fall apart. Dense, well-structured sourdough stayed intact. This is why medieval loaves were firm and resilient. They could be dipped, boiled, reheated, and still remain edible. Modern bread often turns to mush because it was never designed to survive contact with liquid after baking. The idea of eating bread hot from the oven was rare. Fresh bread was often left to rest because it was known to upset digestion. Time allowed moisture to redistribute and structure to settle. Flavor improved. Texture stabilized. Bread became calmer. Medieval bakers understood that patience after baking mattered just as much as patience before it. This mindset also reduced waste. Every loaf had value long after it lost softness. Bread was not judged by how it felt on the first day, but by how useful it remained over time. Modern baking often celebrates freshness because the bread has no future beyond it. Medieval bread was judged by longevity. Even the shape of loaves reflected this thinking. Round, compact forms aged better than wide, open shapes. Thick ends resisted drying. The crust protected the inside like armor. This was intentional. Bread was not fragile, it was meant to endure. By designing bread for a second life, medieval bakers removed fear from baking. Nothing was wasted. Nothing failed simply because it aged. Bread changed form, but it remained food. Modern baking lost this philosophy when convenience replaced necessity. Medieval sourdough was not obsessed with perfection in the moment. It was built for continuity, reuse, and survival. Modern sourdough often looks impressive, but it depends on perfect conditions and constant control. Medieval sourdough was quieter, tougher, and far more honest. It was built for uncertainty, for missed days, for bad weather, for weak grain, and for long waits between meals. Every choice the medieval baker made was shaped by survival, not trends. What was lost over time was not knowledge, but pressure. When baking became comfortable, methods that built resilience were no longer needed, so they were forgotten. But those methods still work. They create bread that forgives mistakes, adapts to change, and remains useful long after it cools. If you bring even a few of these ideas back, your bread will stop feeling fragile. It will stop demanding perfect timing and ideal tools. It will begin to behave the way bread once did: steady, patient, and reliable. Medieval sourdough was not about beauty or precision. It was about endurance, and that is the lesson modern baking needs most.